Good morning, everyone. And so I'm very pleased to be here today. My name is Benjamin Roche. I'm a research director from the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development. And today I'm going to talk about the link between biodiversity and human infectious diseases. So a little bit about the current context. Actually, we're seeing since decades that the number of emerging disease outbreaks is increasing exponentially, being multiplied by 2 since the last 20 years. The point also is that human mobility is also increasing since decades. So it means that today, one local outbreak somewhere in the world can be spread internationally very quickly. And this is why we have all the ingredients to observe new pandemics during next years. So one particular group of infectious disease is threatening. This is what we call the zoonoses, transmitted from animals to humans. And we've seen a lot of examples these last years, including avian influenza, Ebola, or more recently, coronavirus. So why do we have these zoonoses emerging across the world? So a recent report from the IPBES studying the link between biodiversity and pandemics has reviewed more than 700 scientific references and has concluded that land use change, agricultural expansion, and urbanization cause more than 30% of all emerging disease events. So how do we link these human activities with emergence of zoonoses? Actually, when we look at when zoonoses have started to emerge, we're seeing that this is also when the biodiversity decrease has speed up a lot. So definitely it looks like we have a correlation between biodiversity decrease and emergence of zoonoses. But actually, when we study this link, we can understand that it's much more than just a correlation. Indeed, one of the potential explanations is what we call the dilution effect. So let's imagine that we have a vector-borne disease, meaning a pathogen transmitted from one animal species, here a bird, to another animal species through the bite of a vector, so here a mosquito. Just imagine that this vector is biting 3 times during its life. If this vector is surrounded just by a very competent, very susceptible animal species, meaning that when they are exposed to the pathogen, the probability to become infectious is high. It means that each of the bites of these infectious vectors is going to infect a new animal individuals that can in turn infect a new vector individual. So it means that when we have just one species, and competent species, we will have a very high prevalence of pathogen within the vector population. But actually, if we have exactly the same system, but now we don't have just one animal species, what we call reservoir species, but we have a lot of animal species, most of them actually should not be very competent, meaning that they are what we call dead-end host, meaning that when they are exposed to the pathogen, they can become infected, but they cannot become infectious, so they cannot spread the pathogen. So if the vector still bites 3 times during its life, some of these bites, infectious bites, will be done on competent animal individuals, and which can in turn affect new vector individuals. But a lot of these infectious bites will be done on animals that cannot become infectious. And so these bites will be wasted for pathogen transmission. So as a result, the pathogen prevalence in vector population would be much lower if we have a lot of animal species. This is what we call the dilution effect, because it suggests that biodiversity is diluting pathogen transmission. So we have a lot of empirical evidence from this dilution effect. It has been shown on hantaviruses, it has been shown on West Nile, in some part of on Lyme disease. So we have some empirical evidence that it can work. So one interesting point with this dilution effect is actually it can help us to understand how biodiversity alteration leads to an increasing probability of zoonosis emergence. But it also offers us some potential way of action. So meaning that conservation biology or rebuilding strategies can actually decrease the probability of zoonosis emergence. So the question now is, can we use conservation biology for human health? So actually the point is there is no simple answers. So because there is situation when dilution effect can work, like Lyme disease in northeast of the US, hantavirus in Northern Europe, West Nile virus in Louisiana. but some situations where dilution effect doesn't work, like Lyme disease in California, for instance. Moreover, the impact of conservation biology on pathogen transmission is very hard to forecast. So perhaps this is not the good question. So the point is not to figure out if dilution effect works or not. The point is more to figure out in which condition this dilution effect can work. And so to address this question, so in my group, we have developed since a decade now, a different mathematical framework to try to understand on a theoretical point of view what we should expect. So very briefly, here, this is the case of a vector-borne disease. So we have the vector species on the left. So each individual of each vector species can be susceptible, meaning that have not encountered the pathogen so far, or infectious, meaning that they can spread the pathogen to the reservoir communities. And on the right, we have the reservoir communities, where each individual of each species could be susceptible, infectious, but also recovered, meaning that they are immune for the rest of their life. And so the transmission network between these two communities is driven by a matrix that quantifies the contact rate between each different species. The theoretical framework. So now the point is to fill up this theoretical framework with data and different frameworks to actually be able to mimic the complexity of ecological communities. So we've developed different kind of approach based on empirical patterns, on mechanistic models between pathogen transmission and structure of communities, or also a large exploration of parameters. So I'm going to focus just on this last part to try to understand if this dilution effect could be a general phenomenon for vector-borne disease. So what we did is actually, so we try to quantify this relationship between species richness and prevalence in vector populations. So if it's positive, if the slope of this relationship is positive, it means that we have an amplification. If it's negative, it means that we have a dilution. So we assume nothing in this model. So everything is randomly determined. And so we explore that through methods called Latin hypercube sampling. So the good point is, without any kind of assumption, so dilution effect and amplification effects are equally plausible. So meaning that we have no bias in our model. But so when we try to mimic realistic situations in the field, we're seeing that actually with generous vectors, meaning vectors that can bite on every kind of reservoir individuals, dilution effect is much more likely than an amplification effect. So we observe a dilution effect in more than 3/4 of the simulations. So one key parameter for having a dilution effect is actually the correlation between the abundance and the competence of the reservoir. So now to go further, so the ultimate step is really to try to understand what we call the biodiversity paradox. So indeed, we have a link between host and pathogen diversity. So it means that host diversity is correlated with parasite diversity over a very broad range of systems: plant diversity, amphibian parasites, virus, and so on and so forth. And so the biodiversity paradox is actually, so host diversity can decrease transmission of each pathogen, but each host species have also different pathogen from other host species. So it means that greater host diversity means less transmission of each pathogen, but more pathogen within the system. So the real question is, should we protect biodiversity for public health concerns? So we have first clues now, first studies on experimental system that shows that the strength of a dilution effect depends on the parasite diversity, but overall the number of infection is decreasing with host diversity. Of course, this is just the first data we have on that, and we need much more data to develop multi-host and multi-pathogen models. So one key concept for that is the distinction between hazards and risk. So hazard is something that has the potential to harm you, and the risk is the likelihood of a hazard causing harm. So when we try to answer this question, should we apply biological conservation for public health? Actually, we have to consider this gradient between parasite diversity and host diversity. So when we have natural systems that are at some kind of at the middle of this gradient, when we have actually a biodiversity loss, it means that we are decreasing the hazard because we lost host species, and so we lost their pathogens, but we also increase the risk of transmission, because the dilution effect is going to be removed. But when we apply conservation biology, it means that we decrease the risk, but we increase the hazard, because we will have more pathogen within the system. So the real question is actually biological conservation can reduce risk, but keep hazards at a very high level. So it means that if we want to apply conservation biology, we have to do it if we can manage the hazard. So especially on trying to understand how is the contact between wildlife and human population. This is a crucial point to understand how to develop this kind of integrated strategies between conservation biology and human health. So just to conclude, two examples on that. So one project that is currently ongoing in the peninsula of Yucatan in Mexico, where we are running a very large project on the impact of conservation strategies on animal communities. So we monitor the pathogen circulation in degraded forest, in conservated area, in villages, and so on and so forth. And we try also to look at the exposure of human population to understand how these different conservation strategies are actually impacting the exposure of human populations. At a much bigger scale, so the France has initiated the PRESOD initiative beginning of this year, that aims also to try to assess all the factors driving the zoonotic risk, to try to envision strategies to reduce the zoonotic risk and to improve the detection, the spillover detection between animal and human populations. So the goal of the PRESOD initiative is really to act before that a pathogen land into the human population. The goal is really to try to detect it as much as possible and to try to avoid this spillover between human and animal populations and human populations. And I thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone. I'm very glad to present you some insight into the relationship between biodiversity and animal breeding. And today I'm going to see with you if they are friends or foe for infectious and parasitical disease. So in the history recently, or in the 20th century, to face the marked increase in demand for meat production, animal production has raised tremendously since 1960. Here you can see especially for pigs and chicken. And this was done thanks to the creation of industrialized conditions that are based on standardization, control condition, with putting the animal indoors, putting them using lots of input from outside, and that lead to very high productivity. This animal breeding or animal breeding in general are facing different problems regarding infectious and parasitical disease. One of the main problems is the introduction of pathogen within the group, within the animal production. And this can come from the environment, from vectors, from even people working, going in and out of the compound, and from contact with other species. Here you have a study showing that on 40 or around 40 terrestrial pathogens that can affect wild pig, the vast majority of them, 87%, can cause clinical or subclinical disease in at least one species. The other major problem that can face animal facilities is the pathogen or parasitic spread within facilities. This kind of high yield animal production has a generally high density, and this can lead to high transmission rate, especially of contagious disease, such as avian influenza or African swine fever. Also, in this facility, you have group of very high density and low diversity of hosts, and this may lead to increased virulence in pathogen, since susceptible hosts are plenty, and rapid death is unlikely to compromise transmission. The other point is that it can lead to chronic stress, different breeding conditions can lead to chronic stress. And there are reports that suggest that such chronic stress will damage the adaptive immune response to disease and pathogen. So to respond to such a risk, especially in high-yield animal breeding, biosecurity measures are put in place, and the main objectives are to limit the risk of pathogen introduction, limit the spread of pathogen within the same facility, and limit the spread of pathogen and contamination outside of the facility. And when the pathogen manage to enter the facility, sometimes we observe then the response is to proceed to massive curve with high contagious pathogens such as what we have seen in avian influenza or again African swine fever. One of the extreme illustrations of such high yield animal breeding I found in a report in China in Sofar, where you see an entire closed building with breeding of sow, and here you can even see sanitation system to evacuate dead animals. But animal breeding causes increasing environmental and ethical challenge. So there is some demand to lower the environmental impact, increase resilience, and to foster the preservation of biodiversity. One of the response is to apply ecological principle to produce sustainable system. That is done by integrating animal breeding in its ecosystem and increasing the biodiversity. So that's the illustration we're going to see. And the difficulty regarding parasitical or infectious disease is to find in which situation the system will regulate the diffusion of the disease or the introduction rather than amplify it. So we'll see illustration regarding increased biodiversity in the environment to add the diversity within the raised species in a facility, or increase biodiversity as a genetic diversity of the breed, or action at the microbiota. So regarding the diversity of the environment, the relationship between the environment and the consequences on infectious disease or more parasitical disease has been studied more for the parasitic load regarding the composition of the food of herbivores. And there are many reports showing that grazers such as cow or sheep that feed on plants with high tannin show a lower nematode burdens, lower parasitics. And this is interesting, even though it might decrease their efficiency of food intake. There are several reports also showing that animals themselves, when they have high parasitic load, they can choose to feed especially on plants with high tannin, which lead to self-medication. And such a situation where you increase biodiversity of the environment is the agroforestry, is more and more studied now, which lead to interesting ecosystem service, including plants with high tannin. The second illustration is the idea to mix the species on a farming. Here is, I'm showing you the result of an experiment led by some colleagues at INRAE, where they raised a group of 3 groups, one with sheep only, one with sheep and cattle at equal proportion, and one with a little sheep and more cattle. And what you see is, looking at the parasitic load, the sheep, it was lower when they share the pasture with bovine, with cattle, and they gain more weight. And that was not because they eat differently, that was because the parasites were deleted within the cattle. So that's an interesting result, that you have to be aware of transmission of disease that can occur between cattle and sheep, such as herpes virus. The third illustration goes on the genetic diversity within the species. Here you have figures of the FAO showing that in fact there is quite a lot of local animal breeds that are at risk, more than 28%, and a majority of them, we don't have good idea of their status. And this can, on the long term, impair the response of the species to the environmental change that we have to face. So it's quite important to keep this diversity, and to illustrate that regarding infectious disease, I'm showing you here simulation studies for the spread of a pathogen within a livestock population. So it's just one species. On the graph on the left, you see the results that for a group with high genotypes, which are the continuing black line, you have a higher probability for the reproduction number to be above 1, but altogether it is lower, which means the epidemic is less intense. And on the graph on the right, you see that in that condition, in a group with higher genotype, higher diversity, the mortality is lower. So altogether, more diverse population would face smaller epidemics. And the last illustration I would like to share with you is the level of microbiotic diversity. So as you probably know, there is more and more evidence of the link between microbiota and health and pathogens in humans, but such a relation is now being explored for animal health. And it is also the question of if there an optimum of microbiota. What are the factors influencing the composition, and what are the consequences of this disruption of microbiota? And at the level of a farm or of an animal, you could act on many different parts of this system. If microbiota is disrupted, you are causing an imbalance within the microflora, dysbiosis, that can lead to a blooming of pathogen and loss of biodiversity, which can have very disturbing consequences. There is quite a few studies on aquatic species, and here a review showing that there's more and more accumulating evidence that health and zoonotic performance are improved by addressing the microbiota, are improved by adding more prophylactic use of microbiotes. So to conclude, animal breeding is facing the necessity to adapt its practice in a context of the environmental crisis, and the idea is to increase biodiversity and take into account the ecological relationships to change the system. To do that, we need to understand more the mechanism that link this biodiversity, the ecological processes, and the pathogen within animal breeding and with its ecosystem outside, and especially understand the short and the long-term effects. And we need to adapt the local condition with, as there is probably no unique standardized method. This leads to modify and rethink also the food production system in a globalized world. This is one of the objectives for the INRAE, and also it's part of the chain that could list one of the response that we are studying in the PRESOD initiative project that is addressing the question of prevention of zoonotic disease emergence. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, so hello everyone. Very happy to participate in this panel and this fascinating event. So I would like to talk to you about the role of economics in preserving biodiversity. And so the title is to free biodiversity from the economy, but it could also be to free biodiversity from economics and even from economism. So I will try to make this point clear. So the way I will go about this is first, I would like to tell you where we are, which I think is a problematic state, which is what I would call the separatist approach. And I will outline very clearly what I mean by that. Then I will talk about where we should be going, or where we should go, which is the holistic approach to biodiversity rather than the separatist approach. And finally, I will talk about policy, which is that all these analyses have a very direct consequence in terms of the policy we're going to choose in the next months. And of course, I advocate for choosing the holistic approach over the separatist approach. But I think this translates very clearly in terms of the text and the concepts that are being discussed right now in the CBD. Okay, so first, where we are and why this is a problem. So the economic approach to biodiversity is really, I think, a separatist approach in the sense that we are doing three things, which I think are very detrimental to preserving biodiversity and ecosystem. The first thing that we are doing, of course, is we are using GDP growth and growth as a compass for our economies, while of course growth, which is a natural concept, completely ignores biodiversity and ecosystems and natural resources. And so what we are doing when we are setting the economy to just be about developing economic growth is we are basically ignoring biological growth, and we are separating the living world from the social world with this notion of growth. Then we are petrifying the living world with a notion of natural capital, whereby every species, non-human species, is supposed to be a stock, which is of course a huge mistake. And finally, we are fragmenting the living world using the notion of pricing, which is supposed to be the solution to everything. Price everything and everything will be fine. So the three things that we are doing is really instrumentation of the living world, then commodification, and finally monetization. And we are doing this to non-human species under the guise of preserving them. And I think this is a huge mistake. So there are a lot of studies by economists arguing that the problem that we have is that nature doesn't have a value. So the problem is supposed to be the value of nature. I think that this is fundamentally wrong. The problem is the nature of value, not the value of nature. The problem is that we are using an imperialistic economic value, which is both restrictive and destructive. And so what we need to move away from is really economism. And we need to free biodiversity from economism and move toward a more realistic, actually, approach to what the living world is and what the positive role of economics could be in understanding and preserving it. And this is what I would call the holistic approach. That is understanding that the living world is not a stock, but a flow, and that natural resources are not just there to serve us, but they exist as social ecological relations, as links, as bonds. This is a two-way street rather than just nature being there to serve our desires. And so I think that the COVID crisis has shown very clearly that if we destroy our habitat, we will destroy our humanity. On April 7, 2020, which for me is the beginning of the 21st century, you had 4 billion people under lockdown because we are destroying ecosystems and biodiversity all over our planet for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And because our economic systems are fundamentally unsustainable because of this. And what we are destroying then is not economic growth, it's social cooperation. And so the lesson from COVID is that if we destroy our natural links, we will also destroy our social bonds. And on the contrary, it is by restoring our natural links that we can really enjoy our social bonds. And this is why this is holistic. And so what we need is a well-being transition away from GDP growth and this obsession of economic growth, which is, once again, destroying what is dearest to humanity, which is, of course, social relations and social cooperation. And so move away from 20th century economics, which is just outdated, and put health, environment, and the nexus between health and environment as the compass for the economy, not the compass for something else than the economy, while the economy would still run on economic growth, but just a compass for the economy. I think that there are useful concepts or notions or intuitions that can be used in this perspective. I would offer two. The first one is the idea that, you know, the Beveridge Report of 1944, in the middle of the 20th century, right at the heart of 20th century economics, was all about full employment. I think that we should now move towards full health. And by full health, I mean health, human health in all its dimensions: biological, mental health, individual health, collective health, but also, of course, health in relation to its ecological, environmental roots. And full health means, you know, the health of humans, the health of non-humans, and all the dimensions of health. And the other notion might be biosolidarity. What I mean by that is that biodiversity, of course, has existed since the 1980s, even earlier, but at least has been in use since the 1980s. And I think it's all about, you know, counting the diverse species, but not necessarily the links between them, and especially the links between humans and non-human species. And so biosolidarity might be also a notion that we should explore in this idea of, once again, moving from separatist approach to holistic approach. So a representation of this vision is given in this idea of a social ecological feedback loop, whereby you try to really connect the social systems with the natural systems. And what I've been working on is try to understand the key nodes of this social ecological feedback loop. And I found at least two. The one is, of course, the full health nexus, the idea that there is a fundamental relation between social systems and natural systems, and that this relation is not employment, it's not economic growth, it's health. And this is what, you know, should be really the focus now. And the other nexus is the nexus between inequality and sustainability, the idea that the more just the world, the social world will be, the more sustainable it will be, and the more sustainable it will be, and the more just it will be. And so this is the idea, of course, of the just transition. And so these are ideas that at least allow us to move, you know, beyond, once again, the very outdated vision of what is unfortunately presented as a modern approach to biodiversity or economics of biodiversity, which is exactly the opposite. So to close, I would like to finish on policy and moving forward. Of course, we have very important choices to make in the months and weeks ahead. And I think that we must really choose between the separatist approach and holistic approach. I think that they are fundamentally opposite. And I see in the CBD those two visions at play with different texts that are being released. And I think that very clearly there is an opposition between what was presented as a first draft of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, in which my understanding is that, you know, pricing nature and giving, once again, value to nature in the sense of economic value is presented as a central task. Whereas if you look at biodiversity and health global action plan, you will see that is really very much a rights-based approach, holistic consideration of health of all people. And I think this is actually the right direction in which to go. And so it's time to choose, and to choose an approach which is really a 21st century approach of biodiversity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Anna-Liisa Laine, and I'm Professor of Ecology at the University of Zurich, and I direct the Research Center for Ecological Change. And today I'll take the opportunity to talk to you about more microbes, less disease, the magic of biodiversity. The majority of natural biodiversity is made up of parasitic species, and to me this has always been astonishing. By definition, parasites impose a fitness cost on their host, so the parasite benefits while the host only suffers from this interaction. And how can such an interaction be stable in natural communities to the extent that it is in fact the most common way of making a living on Earth? We think that the majority of parasitic species are microbes, so such species that we can't often see them with the plain eye. To be fair, the true diversity of microbial parasitic species is really undescribed. We think that about 5% of microbial species have been described, and we know virtually nothing about their ecological roles. They could be commensalistic, mutualistic, or parasitic in their interactions with the hosts. The big question is that what's keeping parasites in check in natural communities? Why don't we see these runaway dynamics, such as devastating epidemics, as we see in agricultural and human communities? The dilution hypothesis links disease risk to natural levels of biodiversity. It predicts that with increasing levels of biodiversity, we should see reduced levels of disease transmission, so that when we have poor species communities, we would expect to see high disease transmission. And as biodiversity increases and the numbers of species increases, we should see a decrease in disease transmission. The dilution hypothesis has focused on the diversity of host species and the ability of the host community to dilute disease risk. It has been extensively studied in recent years, and it has also been extensively debated. To date, the evidence for the dilution hypothesis has remained mixed. There have been numerous studies, and there have also been numerous meta-analyses that compile different studies together to really try to verify how common this mechanism is in nature and in experimental settings. We recently carried out what could be called a meta-analysis. So we joined 4 different meta-analyses that altogether consisted of some hundreds of studies to really try and understand how biodiversity loss is associated with the dilution hypothesis. And we divided these studies into categories of there having been a recent biodiversity loss and those where there hadn't been a recent biodiversity loss. And we discovered that the dilution effect is robust against biodiversity gradients that have been driven by biodiversity loss. On the other hand, the effect seems to be much more idiosyncratic across diversity gradients that do not involve the biodiversity loss. So something fundamental is perturbed in natural communities when they lose biodiversity, and this has a direct impact on disease transmission. Well, what about microbial biodiversity? Can microbial diversity dilute disease risk? We know virtually nothing about the role of the diversity of microbes, the surrounding community that pathogenic microbes occur in. And so the big questions that we're trying to answer as a field is what influences the diversity of microbes and how is microbial diversity associated with disease risk? The big question of what influences the diversity of microbes in the environment has been intensively studied over the past couple of years, and we're gaining experimental support. These biodiversity experiments, such as the Jena experiment, have been tremendously important for advancing our understanding of biodiversity. And what the Jena experiment that manipulates the levels of plant diversity in small experimental communities has shown is that the more diverse the plant community, the more species you have in that local community, the higher the microbial biomass. We see that this effect is amplified over time, so that if you move from a single species monoculture to a community that consists of 60 different species, the more microbial biomass you will have in the soil microbial communities. And we see that this is also reflected in the diversity of microbial communities. So the more diverse the plant community, the more diverse also the fungal and bacterial communities. And the effect seems to be more pronounced in fungal communities. Well, this is of course an experimental evidence. What do we know about natural communities? Do they also suggest that plant diversity would promote more diverse microbial communities? This is a joint analysis across different communities across the globe, and they discovered that indeed there's strong evidence from natural communities for plant diversity to promote below ground microbial diversity. And the strength of the positive relationship between host community diversity and microbial diversity varies across the biomes that were studied: tropical forests, subtropical forests, temperate grasslands, boreal forests, and shrublands. But nonetheless, we see that the relationship between the two is predominantly positive. And we also know that the environment, such as climatic variables, play a strong role in determining the diversity of microbial communities. Well, what about the role of all microbial diversity? What's the relationship between pathogenic microbial diversity versus all of the microbial diversity that we have in communities? A few years ago, Bartoli et al. Analyzed the microbial communities associated with plant Arabidopsis thaliana. And what they discovered was that the diversity of pathogenic microbes peaked at intermediate levels of overall microbial diversity. But importantly, as the overall microbial diversity started to increase, the diversity of pathogenic microbes started to decrease. So we really see this hump-shaped distribution in the relationship between the two. And this trend was observed both for the microbiota observed above ground on the leaves and below ground in the root microbiota. So thus far, I've told you that natural plant diversity can promote diverse microbial communities, and that also the diversity of the microbial community itself might have a regulatory role in the diversity of pathogenic microbes. But what does this in fact mean for disease dynamics? The best known examples come again from soil microbial communities, and there's a long known effect of the suppressing effect on pathogenic microbes in the soil. This was an experimental study conducted some years ago that clearly demonstrated that diverse bacterial communities can efficiently suppress the dynamic of pathogenic microbial strains. Here we're focusing on strain T of E. coli and how it survives at different soil bacterial diversity levels. And we see that this survival declines already at 3 days and becomes more pronounced as time goes by at 30 and 60 days. Well, what about the impact on human health? The biodiversity hypothesis predicts that humans living in biodiverse environments should suffer fewer disease. A classic example of this is a study that was conducted in Karelia, both on the side of Finland and Russia. And this is an interesting study system because these are very similar in geoclimatic conditions, yet they vary drastically in socioeconomic conditions. And they also vary tremendously in the amount of natural habitat surrounding human habitation. And what this study discovered was that if you compare school children between the years of 7 to 16 in Finnish population and Russian population, the Finnish population suffered significantly higher levels of asthma, hay fever, and a range of allergenic conditions that can be detected with rapid skin tests. And in subsequent studies, it became apparent that on the Finnish side, healthy children had a much more diverse living environment, as well as greater diversity of certain bacterial classes on their skin than atopic children. So jointly, these examples that I've presented today demonstrate that higher plant diversity also promotes higher microbial diversity, and high microbial diversity in itself can lower the diversity of pathogenic microbes to the extent that they have an impact on the dynamics of pathogenic strains. And this doesn't only concern natural communities, but can spill over to have impacts on human population. Thank you for your attention.
Hello and good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Aletta Bonn, and I lead the research group of Ecosystem Services at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, the University of Jena, and the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, IDIB. The title of my presentation is Biodiversity Makes Happy. And what I would like to portray is how biodiversity is essential for our mental health and well-being. So, Biodiversity and health, what's the matter? At the moment, we're experiencing a biodiversity crisis with extinction rates higher than 100 times higher than normal background rates. At the same time, we're experiencing a health crisis with rising health spendings, with up to 11 or more percent of GDP being spent on healthcare. And we do know that 70%, at least 70% of all illnesses are attributable to non-communicable diseases, which is cardiovascular diseases and mental ill health. Also, we're seeing an increasing urbanization in the world, which is a threat to both biodiversity and mental ill health. As more than 5 billion people are expected to live in urban areas, and global urban cover is projected to increase to 1.9 million square kilometers in 2030. And we do know that the risk of developing depression, the most prevalent mental disorder in the world, is 20% higher in urban dwellers than those people who live outside urban areas. So, biodiversity is our foundation of health and well-being, both for physical, mental, and social health. In my talk, I will focus on the mental aspects, mental health and well-being aspects. I would first like to show you a biodiversity and health framework, which we recently published, to show you the pathways how biodiversity and health and well-being is connected. Biodiversity is usually connected to people through contact with biodiversity, both exposure, so the opportunity to actually experience biodiversity, as well as our experience, which is also matched through our nature connectedness and how we perceive biodiversity. There are 4 pathways. On the one hand, reduce harm, for example, reducing exposure to environmental stresses like heat and air pollution, but also provision of medicines, food, and clean water. Then, especially important for mental health, is restoring capacities. Biodiversity can help restore our intention and reduce our stress and facilitate our stress recovery. Third, it can also help building capacities by encouraging physical activity, for example, in parks, or facilitating transcendent experiences, for example, through sacred groves or spiritual experiences we may have in nature. But also there are obviously negative aspects of biodiversity as we're currently experiencing. So, for example, it can cause harm by increasing risk of allergies or infectious disease, or in fact harmful microbiota. Here I will focus on the restoring capacities with respect to mental health and well-being. I would like to show you some results from our study. And here we looked at the mental health of people in Leipzig, and we were lucky to work with the University of Leipzig together with 10,000 adults in Leipzig. And we took a very everyday biodiversity measure, which is urban street trees, something which you can retrofit really easily. But we also used a very strong quantitative health measure, the prescription rates of antidepressants. So we had data on almost 10,000 adults in Leipzig and their prescriptions of antidepressants, and the how many trees were in the immediate vicinity of their homes. We looked at different aspects. As we can see in this graph, we can see, for example, in yellow, that, for example, how pessimistic or optimistic a person is, what the weight of a person, and whether they smoke is a significant risk for depression. Also, in purple, in the lower part, employment, gender, as well as age are risk factors for depression. But if we account for all of these in green, street tree density was a significant predictor for minimizing antidepressant levels or prescriptions of antidepressants. So we looked at the street tree density of people who were prescribed antidepressants, and in the vicinity of buffers of 1,000 meter, 500, 300, and 100 meter. And as you can see from this graph, it was the immediate surrounding of the home that mattered. So the trees you see from your window, the trees when you get out of your door, walk to school or to work, which you may not even notice, but these were important and they had were significantly associated with reduced antidepressant prescriptions. So it's not the park, which is further on, but it's actually the street trees which are in the immediate vicinity. And here we also saw that this was especially important for people with lower socioeconomic status. They already have a higher risk of suffering from depression and anxiety. And here we could see that this relationship was especially significant for this portion of society, and thereby street trees can contribute to happiness, and they are also an easy measure for improving health equity. I would like to show you two more examples. At a greater scale, we looked at biodiversity and life satisfaction at a European level. Here, we were lucky to use the European Survey of Quality of Life in 2012 with individual surveys, and we could use almost 25,000 individual surveys from this over 24 countries at the time. And we compared these with different aspects of biodiversity, and one of them was bird biodiversity. Here we could see that bird species richness was significantly correlated with life satisfaction. So across all countries, if in this graph you can see the analyses for each country, there was a rise in life satisfaction the more bird species were in the surroundings of the people. So we took here the NUTS units, so the county scales. And it was surprising. Here we can see that a proportionate increase of bird species richness led to a higher life satisfaction. And in fact, a proportionate increase in bird species richness actually had even higher effects than a proportionate increase in net household income. This shows that bird biodiversity is really important for people's life satisfaction, and these are some things how biodiversity can contribute to happiness. Here we have to obviously ask ourselves, how does this come to place? This can be either through direct experience of birds, by watching them or by listening to them, but it could also be an indirect experience through the varied landscape, which might provide more habitat for birds. But this was true at a European level and a very coarse scale. Now, we also wanted to know, we often think about biodiversity which is visually experienced. I show you one last study where we looked at soundscapes and bird sounds and well-being. And here we did a laboratory study. We had bird recordings from 8 parks in Brisbane in Australia. And we looked at, and we played them to people in the lab to actually eliminate all other aspects. And we looked at the relationship of perceived restorativeness with regards to perceived bird biodiversity. But here we interacted this with traffic sounds. So these samples also had different soundscapes of traffic. And what you can see on the next slide is that perceived restorativeness was associated with a higher perceived bird biodiversity. So the more birds you could hear, so the sound of birds. But this was negatively affected by traffic noise. So those samples which had the same amount of birds but had higher traffic noise were actually rated lower in restorativeness. This has important repercussions for spatial planning. So if we can introduce the experience of bird sounds in everyday life, and then through careful urban green planning as well as mobility planning, also reduce traffic noise, we can contribute to the mental health and well-being of not only urban dwellers, but obviously everyone. So in conclusion, I hope I could show you a few examples of why biodiversity makes happy. So street tree density was immediately around the home mattress and was linked to decreased risk of antidepressant prescriptions. And thereby street trees are an easy nature-based solutions for city to retrofit for improving public health and creating livable cities. Second, bird biodiversity is linked to life satisfaction both through direct experience as well as indirectly through varied landscapes. And thirdly, bird sounds also matter and are connected with restorativeness. Here, other aspects like traffic noise can disturb the well-being effects, and proactive urban planning is needed. With this, I would like to end and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.